A woman in white gloves walked toward a lake at dawn. She never made it. Geneva, September 10th, 1898. The Empress of Austria, one of the most photographed women in Europe, was crossing the Rue de Lausanne toward the water. She moved with the kind of grace that had made her legendary across the continent. Behind her, a young Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucheni had been watching. I've read the police statements myself. What struck the officers wasn't the crime. It was that she didn't even realize she'd been stabbed until she collapsed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why an anarchist wanted her dead, you need to go back 40 years, to a 16-year-old girl named Elizabeth who walked into one of history's most gilded traps without knowing it was closing around her. Elizabeth came from Bavarian nobility, comfortable, but not imperial. In 1853, her mother was invited to Vienna to present her older sister as a potential bride to Emperor Franz Joseph. The 16-year-old Elizabeth tagged along. What happened next was the kind of romantic accident that destroys lives. Franz Joseph took one look at Elizabeth and forgot her sister existed. He was obsessed. They married within months. Elizabeth became Empress of Austria-Hungary at 17. The court called her Sisi, and within a year she was pregnant. Within 5 years she'd given birth to 3 children. She was trapped in the Hofburg Palace, suffocating under protocol, watched constantly, her body no longer her own. Sisi developed what we'd now recognize as an eating disorder. She obsessed over her appearance, her waist, her skin, her hair. She began traveling constantly, leaving her children behind. She'd spend hours exercising, sometimes in secret. The court was scandalized. The empress wasn't behaving like an empress. Her marriage became a hollow performance. Franz Joseph had mistresses. Sisi had lovers, or at least the court whispered she did. She wrote poetry about freedom and death, dark, beautiful poetry. She wrote about wanting to escape. I've read some of those verses. They read like a woman counting down. By the 1890s, Sisi was in her 60s and still beautiful, or obsessed with appearing so. She wore corsets so tight they damaged her ribs. She dyed her hair black. She traveled constantly to Hungary, to Greece, to the Mediterranean. She was running from something, or running toward something. Nobody knew anymore. In September 1898, she was staying in Geneva, a relatively quiet city, a place where she could walk without ceremony. She'd hired security, but loosely. She didn't want guards. She wanted to move through the world like a regular person, just for once. That freedom was the one thing she'd never had as empress. Luigi Lucheni was 25 years old, unemployed and radicalized. He'd been following anarchist movements across Europe. He decided he would kill someone famous, someone who represented the old order. He didn't know Sisi personally. She was simply a target, a symbol. On the morning of September 10th, Sisi was walking to catch a steamer. It was early. The streets were nearly empty. Lucheni approached from behind, a sharpened file in his hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't announce himself. He just stabbed her once deeply between her ribs. Sisi didn't scream. Witnesses said she simply staggered. She reached the dock. She boarded the steamer. It wasn't until she sat down in her cabin and felt the blood that she understood what had happened. By then, it was too late. The wound had pierced her heart. She died within hours. Lucheni was arrested immediately. He showed no remorse. He told police exactly why he'd done it, because she was a symbol of imperial excess while workers starved. The court was stunned. The woman they'd never fully understood was gone. What struck me most, reading the accounts decades later, was how little anyone had actually known her. She'd spent 45 years as empress, and people still couldn't say who she really was. Was she a victim of duty? A woman trapped by beauty and circumstance? Or was she someone who chose her isolation, who preferred the myth to the person? Lucheni served 14 years in prison. He never recanted. He believed he'd struck a blow against monarchy itself. Whether he killed the real Elizabeth or just the symbol, that question was never answered. Maybe there was no difference. Franz Joseph lived another 16 years after her death. He never remarried. He never fully explained what their marriage had been. He kept her rooms exactly as she'd left them, a museum to a woman he'd loved and never really known. Sisi became a legend after her death, more famous in death than she'd ever been in life. Books were written, plays were staged. A Hollywood film made her a romantic heroine. But the real Elizabeth, the woman who wrote dark poetry, who starved herself, who couldn't breathe under the weight of a crown, she remained a mystery. That's the real tragedy, not the knife. The silence. Subscribe for more stories of royal obsession and palace violence, the kind of history they don't teach in textbooks.